June 18th, 1815. One day. That's all it took to decide the fate of Europe for the next century. This single day, near a small Belgian village named Waterloo, saw the final, bloody showdown of one of history's most brilliant and controversial figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a clash of titans, an epic confrontation that ended an era of unprecedented warfare and redrew the map of the world. So, how did it all come to this? How did one battle become so legendary? And what really happened on that rain-soaked field? Let's dive into the story of the Battle of Waterloo. To understand Waterloo, we have to go back just 100 days. Napoleon, the once Emperor of France, had been defeated and exiled to the tiny island of Elba. The great powers of Europe, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia breathed a collective sigh of relief. They thought the Napoleonic Wars were finally over. They were wrong. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped. He landed in France with a handful of followers, and what happened next was extraordinary. The soldiers sent to arrest him instead flocked to his banner, shouting, "Vive! Il marchait dans Paris," gathering an army as he went, and reclaimed his throne without firing a single shot. The so-called 100 Days had begun. Europe was thrown into chaos. The Allied powers, gathered at the Congress of Vienna to decide the future of the continent, were stunned. They immediately declared Napoleon an outlaw and formed the Seventh Coalition to depose him once and for all. They planned to invade France from all sides with overwhelming force. But Napoleon was never one to wait for his enemies to come to him. His only chance was to strike first, to defeat the Allied armies in detail before they could unite. His target was the two closest armies, camped just across the border in modern-day Belgium, the British-led Allied army under the Duke of Wellington, and a Prussian army under the grizzled veteran Marshal. Napoleon's strategy was classic Napoleon. Find the weak point between the two armies, drive a wedge through it, and then turn to crush each army separately. He moved with lightning speed, catching his opponents off guard. On June 16th, 2 days before Waterloo, he engaged both armies simultaneously in two separate battles. At the Battle of Ligny, he dealt a heavy blow to Blucherest Prussians, forcing them to retreat. At the same time, at the crossroads of Quatre-Bras, his Marchionnais fought a bloody but inconclusive battle against Wellington's forces. Napoleon believed his plan was working. He assumed the defeated Prussians would retreat east, away from Wellington. This was his first critical miscalculation. The Prussians, Tugbaten, were not broken. Instead of retreating east, Blucher, urged on by his chief of staff, made the fateful decision to retreat north, parallel to Wellington, promising to come to his aid if he was attacked. This brings us to the eve of the main event. Wellington, learning of the Prussian defeat but also of their promise to support him, chose his ground. He pulled his army back to a low ridge just south of the village of Waterloo. It was a brilliant defensive position. The ridge would protect his infantry from the full force of French artillery. And 3 fortified farmhouses in front of his lines Hougoumont. On his right La Haye, Sanct in the center, and Papelotte on his left would act as breakwaters disrupting any French attack. That night, a torrential thunderstorm broke out. The fields turned into a sea of mud. This mud would play a crucial role, delaying the start of the battle and exhausting the soldiers who had to fight in it. The morning of June 18th dawned gray and wet. Napoleon was confident. He had a slight numerical advantage and, more importantly, a significant superiority in cavalry and artillery. He famously remarked at breakfast, "This affair is nothing more than eating breakfast." But the mud forced him to delay his attack. He wanted the ground to dry so his cannons could be moved easily, and so their cannonballs would bounce, causing maximum carnage. The battle finally began around 11:30 a.m. with a massive French artillery barrage, followed by an attack on the chateau of Hougoumont. Napoleon intended this as a diversion to draw Wellington's reserves to the right flank. But the fight for Hougoumont quickly escalated into a savage battle within a battle, sucking in thousands of French troops for the rest of the day. The steadfast defense of the British and German troops at Hougoumont was the first heroic chapter of the day for the Allies. Around 1:30 p.m., Napoleon launched his main infantry assault against Wellington's center-left. 80 French cannons pounded the Allied line, and then, for massive columns of 16,000 French infantrymen, led by General Durlin, marched up the slope. It was a terrifying sight. They pushed back the Dutch-Belgian troops in the front line, but Wellington was ready. As the French reached the crest of the ridge, he gave the order, "Up, guards!" And at him, his British infantry, who had been lying down to avoid the cannon fire, rose up and unleashed devastating volleys of musket fire at point-blank range. Then, the British heavy cavalry, the Royal Scots Greys, and the Household Cavalry charged. They crashed into the French columns, shattering them and sending them reeling back down the slope in disarray. The charge was a spectacular success, but the British cavalry, drunk on victory, went too far. They galloped on towards the French cannons, where they were countercharged by French lancers and cuirassiers, and suffered terrible losses. By mid-afternoon, Napoleon's initial plan was in tatters. The attack on Hougoumont was a stalemate, and the main infantry assault had been repulsed, and now he had a new problem. On his right flank, the first troops of the Prussian army were beginning to appear. The race against time had begun. Napoleon had to break Wellington's army before Blucher could arrive in force. In a desperate and perhaps poorly coordinated move, the great French cavalry commander, Marshal Ney, mistook a routine movement of Allied troops for a retreat. He launched one of the most famous cavalry charges in history. Thousands upon thousands of French heavy cavalry cuirassiers, in gleaming breastplates and dragoons with their horsehair, helmets thundered up the slope towards the Allied line. But Wellington's infantry wasn't retreating. They had formed defensive squares. These were like human hedgehogs, bristling with bayonets. The French cavalry surged around them like a tide around rocks, but they could not break them. Again and again, they charged, only to be driven back by disciplined volleys of musket fire. It was a magnificent but futile display of courage. While the cavalry charges were failing, Ney, known as the bravest of the brave, finally managed to capture the central farmhouse of La Haye-Saint. This was a critical moment. With the farm in his hands, he could bring up horse artillery and blast a hole in Wellington's already battered center. The Allied line was stretched to the breaking point. Wellington was seen riding up and down the line, encouraging his men, praying for Nito Blucher to come. This was the crisis point of the battle. If Napoleon had committed his final reserve, the elite Imperial Guard, a tease moment he might have won. But he hesitated. He was forced to send some of his precious guard units to fend off the growing Prussian threat on his flank. The opportunity was lost. By 7:30 p.m., it was do or die. With the Prussians now heavily engaged on his right, Napoleon knew he had one last throw of the dice. He committed his legendary Imperial Guard to a final assault on Wellington's center. These were the veterans of his greatest victories, the grognards, the old guard, who had never known defeat in battle. With drums beating the PAD charge, they marched up the ridge in two massive columns, a wave of bluecoats and bearskin hats, with Napoleon himself leading them part of the way. The fate of the battle hung in the balance. But Wellington was waiting. Again, his infantry held their fire until the last possible moment. As the guard crested the ridge, they were met with a storm of lead. The British foot guards, who had been lying down, rose up and fired a devastating volley. The invincible guard faltered. They stopped. And then, for the first time in their history, they began to fall back. A cry went up through the Allied ranks. La garde recule, the guard retreats. It was a moment of profound shock for the French army. Seeing their elite comrades retreating, the morale of the entire French line shattered. Wellington, sensing the decisive moment, stood in his stirrups and waved his hat in the air the signal for a general advance. His entire line surged forward. At the same time, the Prussians finally broke through on the French right flank, turning the retreat into a rout. The French army dissolved into a panicked mob, fleeing the field. Napoleon was swept away in the chaotic retreat, his empire crumbling around him. The battle was over. The Duke of Wellington and Marshal Blucher met near the Inn of La Belle Alliance, sealing their hard-won victory. The Battle of Waterloo was devastatingly costly. Terre weri ober, 45,000 casualties. On that single day, it was the definitive end of the Napoleonic Wars that had ravaged Europe for more than 2 decades. The battle ushered in a period of relative peace in Europe, the so-called Pax Britannica, and established Great Britain as the world's dominant power for the next century. Waterloo is more than just a battle. It's a story of strategy, desperation, incredible courage, and fateful decisions. It's a testament to how the actions of a few individuals and a bit of mud can change the course of history forever. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey back to 1815 interesting, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Let us know in the comments what other battles you'd like to see covered. See you next time.